Most American gardeners look at a perennial bed in mid-July, see faded flowers and floppy stems, and assume the show is over until next year. It is not over, it is paused. And the difference between a garden that fades quietly into August and one that produces a genuine second wave of color comes down to one decision most people are afraid to make: cutting back a plant that still has some green on it. Research from the University of Vermont Extension and trials at the Chicago Botanic Garden confirms that strategic summer cutting back increases repeat bloom frequency by 40 to 70% in species like Salvia and Coreopsis. That is not a marginal improvement. That is the difference between a border that ends in July and one that carries color into October. Today I am showing you 10 perennials that respond to this technique, exactly when to cut, and exactly how much. Stay through to the end because the timing mistake most gardeners make costs them the entire second bloom. Drop your USDA zone in the comments right now. Timing shifts by region, and I will be specific throughout this entire video. Drop it below. Why cutting back works. When a perennial finishes its first bloom, it shifts energy towards seed production. That process consumes a significant share of the plant's resources for the rest of the season, pulling sugars and stored energy away from new growth and toward the work of forming and ripening seed. Cutting back the spent flower stalks interrupts that shift before it fully takes hold. The plant redirects stored carbohydrates and growth hormones, specifically the cytokinins and auxins, responsible for new shoot development, toward fresh growth and lateral buds instead of seed production and natural decline. That is not a trick or a folk remedy passed between gardeners. It is basic plant physiology rooted in how perennials allocate energy across a growing season, and it is exactly why this technique works consistently across so many unrelated species. 1. Salvia nemorosa, woodland sage. Cut back by 1/2 to 2/3 immediately after the first bloom fades, usually late June in zones 4 through 7. Remove all flower spikes along with any yellowing lower leaves at the same time. New growth emerges quickly from the base, and the plant is often blooming again by late July, sometimes producing a flush that rivals the first in both color and stem count. This is one of the fastest and most reliable rebloomers on this entire list. 2. Catmint, Nepeta Walker's Low. When the first flush starts looking tired and the gray-green foliage begins to thin out, cut the entire plant back by half. It looks severe for about 10 days, and you may second-guess the decision during that window. Then it returns with a second flush that is often heavier than the first. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. Most gardeners skip this cut entirely and lose 6 to 8 weeks of color every summer without ever understanding why their catmint underperformed compared to a neighbor's. 3. Coreopsis verticillata, Moonbeam, or Zagreb. Shear uniformly to 6 inches tall in early July. This eliminates the floppy, leggy stems that develop by midsummer and resets the flowering cycle completely from the base upward. New blooms appear within 3 to 4 weeks of the cut. Skip this cut if the plant is visibly drought-stressed at the time, since a stressed plant lacks the reserves to recover quickly. Wait for consistent moisture first, then proceed. 4. Hardy Geranium, Roseanne or Biocovo. This is the cut that feels the most alarming and produces the most dramatic result of anything on this list. Cut the entire plant back almost to the ground, leaving only a few inches of stem above the crown. New green leaves unfurl within days, and the plant returns to bloom shortly after, often within 2 to 3 weeks. Most gardeners hesitate because the cut looks so severe in the moment. Hardy geraniums recover from this faster than almost anything else you will grow. 5. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium. After the first flush turns brown and ragged, cut the stems back to the fresh basal foliage at the base of the plant rather than leaving tall brown stalks standing through summer. The second round of blooms will be smaller than the first, but still genuinely attractive, and it pairs beautifully with ornamental grasses and late-season color as the border transitions into fall. In mild, longer-growing seasons, yarrow can be trimmed as late as mid-August and still produce a second bloom before cold weather arrives. If the plant was only established this season, stick to light deadheading instead of a hard cut, since young yarrow needs a full season to build the root reserves a hard cut back demands. 6. Bee Balm, Monarda didyma. Cut back by half in early July if mildew has appeared on the foliage, or the stems are leaning outward under their own weight. This improves air circulation through the clump immediately and often produces a cleaner, healthier second bloom in late August. The cut also removes the fungal pressure that builds steadily in dense, humid bee balm clumps through the hottest weeks of midsummer, which is often the real reason the second flush looks better than the first. 7. Garden phlox, Phlox paniculata. Cut back by 1/3 to 1/2 in early July before powdery mildew has a real chance to take hold in the dense foliage. Focus on removing the upper, most crowded stems and the older foliage near the base of the plant. Never shear this plant flat across the top, which destroys its natural form. Selectively thin instead, opening up the center of the clump so air moves through it freely, and reduces the disease pressure that gives garden phlox its undeserved reputation for problems. 8. Shasta daisy, leucanthemum. Once the first wave of blooms fades, and the stems begin flopping open under their own weight, cut the entire clump back to the basal foliage near ground level. This is the same shearing technique that works well on threadleaf Coreopsis and several other mounding perennials with similar growth habits. A flush of fresh leaves follows within 1 to 2 weeks, often with a second round of clean white flowers close behind. 9. Blanket flower, Gaillardia. Blanket flower thrives in poor soil and hot, sunny conditions, which makes it one of the most reliable rebloomers for the parts of an American summer that exhaust other plants completely. Cut back the spent flower heads to fresh growth once the first flush turns brown and dry. Within weeks, new growth and another flush of blooms appear, often lasting all the way until the first frost arrives in fall. 10. Veronica, Speedwell. When the flower spikes finish and begin to brown at the tip, cut them back to just above the next set of healthy leaves rather than shearing the whole plant uniformly across the top. This selective approach keeps the plant from looking butchered or bare while still triggering the new spike growth that produces the second round of color through late summer and into early fall. The timing rule that determines whether this works at all. Here is the mistake that costs most gardeners the entire second bloom. Cutting back too late in the season. Every plant on this list needs 6 to 8 weeks of active growing time after the cut to produce fresh foliage, set new buds, and open flowers before the first fall frost arrives and ends the growing season for good. Know your average first frost date for your specific area. Count backward 8 weeks from that date. That is your final cutback deadline for this entire list. And pushing past it means investing effort for foliage you will never see flower. In zones 3 through 6, this generally means cutting back no later than the 3rd week of July for a reliable second bloom before frost arrives. In zones 7 through 9, the window extends into early August because the growing season runs noticeably longer on the back end of the year. Never cut back during a heat wave above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or while a plant is visibly drought-stressed. A plant under water deficit does not have the metabolic capacity to heal the cut and generate fresh growth efficiently. Wait for temperatures to moderate and soil moisture to stabilize before making any of these cuts. Cutting a stressed plant does not trigger rebloom. It simply adds mechanical stress on top of the moisture stress it is already managing. After the cut, every plant on this list needs the same basic aftercare to recover quickly and bloom again on schedule. Water well immediately after cutting to support the root system through the stress of losing top growth. A light feed of compost or a diluted liquid fertilizer applied to the root zone supports the new growth the plant is about to produce over the following weeks. Do not apply heavy nitrogen fertilizer after a summer cutback. It pushes excessive leafy growth at the expense of the flower buds you are actually trying to encourage. A gentle, balanced feed is enough to support recovery without redirecting the plant's energy away from blooming. Expect the second flush to look slightly different from the first. New stems are typically shorter than the original growth. Flowers are sometimes a bit smaller in size, though often more abundant in number across the clump. That is entirely normal, and does not mean anything went wrong with your technique. It is simply how a second bloom cycle performs compared to the first. And most gardeners find they actually prefer the tidier, more compact look of the second flush. What this changes about your garden. A perennial border that gets this treatment in early to mid-July does not fade quietly in August the way most American gardens do. It produces a second compressed, tidy flush of color that carries straight into September and often right up to the first frost. That is the entire difference between a garden that looks finished by late summer and one that still has something happening in every bed when your neighbor's gardens have already gone quiet and brown. Pick 2 or 3 plants from this list that are already growing in your beds right now. Try the cut on one clump first if you are nervous about how severe it looks. Watch what happens over the following 3 weeks. Once you see the result with your own eyes, you will not hesitate to do it across the entire border next season. Drop a comment below and tell me which perennial from this list you are cutting back first, along with your USDA zone. I read every comment. If this gave you one thing you are trying this week, subscribe right now. Practical, research-based, zone-specific gardening content every single week. The next video is already coming. Make sure it finds you.